Having a moratorium on jobs, especially in the public sector, where they're saying that they won't be retrenching people at the moment, and there is a commitment that's been made by business to say that they also will look at avenues instead of just outright retrenching people. But they've also said that they are looking at possibly cutting CEOs' salaries and perhaps shareholders not receiving dividends, which I was mentioning earlier that I find that highly unlikely that CEOs would forgo or would have their salaries cut and shareholders would forgo dividends. But that's one of the proposals. They're also saying that over the next 5 years, they're planning, as a result of these interventions, to have or create around 275,000 jobs. This is over and above the 300,000 jobs target that government has set for itself every year to create jobs. But Xoli, while we're at that, I've got a guest at the moment. Her name is Tessa Dooms, who's the MD of the Youth Lab. We're just going to have a chat with her to find out what is it how she feels about the interventions here that the government has presented. Tessa, welcome to eNCA. Thank you very much for your time. You are the MD of Youth Lab. Just take us through briefly, what does the Youth Lab do?
So the Youth Lab is a youth policy think tank, and our job is to mainstream young people's perspectives into decision-making spaces. So we host dialogues with young people amongst themselves about important policy decisions. We bring young people in the room with political parties and policymakers so that they can hear young people's voices and take them seriously. But we also try and capacitate young people with both information and skills so they can become drivers of their own agendas, drivers of their own lives in their communities and in the businesses they're trying to run.
Are politicians or government, are they hearing young people? Because one of the things that came out here yesterday was that this is about jobs, and unemployment affects largely young people, but we don't see really young people in the summit. Are they being heard by government?
I don't think government is doing enough to hear young people. And I'll give two ways in which I think this is true. I think first in the political party space. I think the phenomenon of the youth leagues and the youth wings have become a way in some ways to sometimes undermine the youth voice rather than raise it. Sometimes to kind of say, young people have their own space and they're going to speak there in the corner by themselves, and then they'll tell us later what they've said. And I think that needs to be challenged, because I think young people need the seat at the decision-making table because they are the majority of the country. If the young people are just sitting and having conversations on their own in the corner, that's not necessarily the most useful way of engaging. But on the other hand, it's also about just government's general ability to do public participation. And again, if you're doing public participation correctly, you will encounter young people, because young people are the majority in their communities. And so as Youth Lab, we've done extensive work across the country. And every time we've convened young people, they've come, they've shared their views, they've shared what they want. But what they've said to us consistently is that government doesn't convene them, that political parties don't convene them, that they have a lack of trust in the decision makers because the decision makers aren't hearing them unless they're politically aligned. And so for me, it's a call to government, it's a call to political parties, it's a call particularly to the governing party to say, put politics aside for some times and really just listen to young people and take them seriously, not only as beneficiaries of your policies, but they can also partner with you and they can also lead. And you need to find ways to hear their voices in more than just their complaints, but also their suggestions.
One of the barriers for young people in terms of gaining employment is that of experience. Do you feel that that has been addressed with these interventions in terms of trying to get young people who 50% of them are unemployed, according to data, to get them to jobs? We've got initiatives like the Youth Employment Service. Are those working for young people? But especially the issue of experience, which is a huge barrier for a lot of young people.
Absolutely. Young people mention the experience barrier consistently when we ask them about employment. And I as much as something like, for instance, the YES initiative or the government's internship programs and learnership programs are important initiatives, what we need to move beyond is companies calling for experience as the criteria. So it's one thing to say young people must have experience, but if all young people had experience, we still don't know that companies are willing to take them on. And I think experience has become a buffer for a broader conversation about what is it going to take for South African companies to start absorbing labor permanently.
You were involved with the National Planning Commission. You're one of the commissioners there. What are the goals of the NDP in terms of employing young people? I know that the total goal of unemployment in terms of the NDP is 6% by 2030, which looks unlikely that we're going to reach that goal. But in terms of young people, what is that goal, and where are we in terms of trying to reach it, particularly with regards to young people?
So the NDP doesn't specify a particular percentage of that should be youth. What the NDP does emphasize is two things. That one, SMEs, which should be the biggest driver of employment, as according to the NDP, should be youth-owned SMEs largely. And secondly, that youth are the biggest population, and therefore the employment issue must center around youth. So I think the NDP makes that perfectly clear. But I think the one thing we've done within the Commission is that we've looked at the landscape of youth employment and youth employability programs in the country. And we've asked ourselves, as the National Planning Commission, do we really know what programs exist to help young people get into employment? Are they functioning effectively? How much money is being spent on them, and what's that return on investment?
Tessa, one final question quickly. I mean, we're seeing this uprise in terms of, coloured communities. What do you think in terms of them being represented, them having access to jobs, access to services? I mean, they've raised this consistently that they're being ignored, and hence we're seeing a lot of protests and dissatisfaction.
Right. So I started my career about 15 years ago, working in a youth employment centre in Msobombo Centre in El Dorado Park, the community I was raised in. And even at that point, coloured communities did feel excluded from national conversation. It's not that coloured communities' issues are different from the issues of the majority of black people in our country and African people in our country. The question is about engagement and the feeling of inclusion and the feeling that they have access to spaces, especially political spaces. I think we also need to be very careful about the current protests that are happening. The current protests that are happening are not economic. There have been protests in the past that have been about economic issues, about housing. The current protest is about safety. And safety has got a particular look and feel in coloured communities because of drugs and because of gangsterism and the way those two play into each other. And I think coloured communities have a very legitimate claim to saying we need a specific intervention that looks at the unique ways in which these two things are affecting especially young women in those communities. Because it's the safety of young women generally that's affected, but the safety of young women in terms of transactional sex, in terms of drug-related things, that's been issues in coloured communities for a long time, and I think that the grievance is real and it should be addressed, but I don't think it's all that different from the broader society, but we do need to say that coloured communities need more engagement and to feel like they're part of the South African society in a real way and not excluded.
Tessa Dooms, thank you so much. Koli, as you heard there, I guess Tessa Dooms saying that the coloured community do have a legitimate claim in terms of wanting to be made feel safe, but also just worrying about young people